You ever watch someone build their own downfall, one truckload at a time? The first thing that hit me wasn't the noise. It was the smell. Hot diesel hanging thick in the morning air, mixing with the sharp bite of fresh-cut timber. I hadn't even killed my engine yet when I saw the headlights crawling up the hill. My hill, one after another like a slow-moving invasion. Gravel crunched under their tires, that familiar sound I knew better than my own heartbeat, because I paid for every inch of that road. Built it with my own money, graded it myself, packed it down layer by layer until it could handle anything from a pickup to a fully loaded concrete truck. And now it was carrying strangers. I sat there for a second, hands still on the wheel, watching them climb. The beam from their headlights cut through the early morning fog, stretching long across the slope like they already owned the place. Cabins. That's what they were building. I could see the outlines now, wood frames rising where nothing but open grass had stood a month ago. 12 of them, maybe more. Neat little rows, perfectly spaced, like someone had taken a ruler to land that didn't belong to them. I stepped out, boots hitting gravel with that same crunch, but it sounded different now. Heavier. Wrong. The air carried the low hum of generators, the metallic clank of tools, the dull thud of hammers echoing across the ridge. Every sound bounced back at me like the land was trying to tell me something I already knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. I walked a few yards up the slope, just enough to see the full spread. Framing crews moving like they had deadlines. Materials stacked in clean, organized piles. Survey stakes driven into the dirt like they had every legal right to be there. That's when I noticed the sign. Whiteboard. Clean lettering. Future site of Pine Ridge Cabins. A Willow Creek HOA community. I actually laughed. Not loud. Not angry. Just a quiet breath through my nose. The kind you let out when something's so bold it almost deserves respect. Almost. Because here's the thing they didn't know. That road they were using? The one carrying every truck, every worker, every piece of lumber up that hill? It wasn't part of their plan. It wasn't in their permits. And it sure as hell wasn't theirs. I built that road 10 years ago, back when this hill was nothing but scrub grass and a view nobody thought was worth anything. Cost me just over $80,000 out of pocket, plus weekends I'll never get back. Every drainage ditch, every layer of crushed stone, every inch of grading. I remember it all. Because I didn't build it for them. I built it for me. And as I stood there, watching another truck grind its way up the slope like it belonged, I realized something simple. They could build whatever they wanted on that hill. They could pour concrete, raise walls, sell dreams to anyone willing to buy them. But there was one detail they'd overlooked. One small, quiet piece of the puzzle they never bothered to check. There's only one way in, and only one way out. I grew up learning that land remembers who takes care of it. My father used to say that while we stood at the base of this hill, boots sinking slightly into the loose gravel before I ever had the money to pack it down properly. Back then, the road was nothing more than a rough cut through scrub and rock, barely wide enough for an old pickup to crawl its way up without scraping both sides. I can still hear the engine from his truck, that low, uneven rumble as it fought its way uphill, tires slipping on loose stone, dust rising in thick clouds that clung to your throat and made every breath taste dry. He never complained. Not once. He would just nod toward the slope and say, "If you want something to last, you build the path to it yourself." That stuck with me. Years later, after he passed and the deed came down to me, this hill was all I had left that felt real. No big inheritance, no trust fund, just 83 acres of uneven ground, stubborn soil, and a view that stretched for miles if you were willing to earn it. I worked contracts during the week, infrastructure jobs mostly, long days measuring grades, calculating drainage, designing access routes for people who had the money to build faster than they understood. Nights and weekends, I came back here. I mapped every foot of that road myself, walking it with a tape measure clipped to my belt, boots grinding against rock and clay, marking turns with bright orange flags that snapped in the wind. I remember the smell of wet earth the first time I cut drainage along the lower bend, the way the water finally stopped pooling and started moving the way it was supposed to. I remember hauling gravel by the ton, spreading it in layers, compacting it until the surface held firm under pressure, until the crunch underfoot sounded clean instead of loose. It took me almost a year to finish it. A full 12 months of early mornings, late nights, and hands that stayed rough no matter how many times I washed them. When it was done, that road was not just access. It was control. One way in, one way out. No shared easements. No public right-of-way. Every inch of it documented, surveyed, and filed exactly the way it needed to be. I made sure of that, because I had seen what happened when people assumed access without owning it. They treated it like it was theirs until someone proved otherwise. Standing there now, watching those trucks climb without hesitation, I could feel that same grit under my boots, but the meaning had shifted. They were using something I built like it was part of their plan, like it had always been there for them. Another truck passed me, suspension creaking under the weight of lumber, the driver barely glancing in my direction as he followed the curve I had measured down to the inch. The engine noise faded as it climbed higher, replaced by the steady rhythm of construction above. Hammering, saw blades whining, the distant hum of generators. It all blended into a kind of confidence, the sound of people who believed they had already won. I looked up at the cabins again, sunlight starting to break across their frames, catching the edges of fresh wood and turning them almost gold. To anyone else, it might have looked like progress, opportunity, a new development rising exactly where it was supposed to. But I knew better, because every single one of those structures depended on something they did not own, something they had not even bothered to question. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. They did not just overlook the road. They built their entire future on the assumption that it would always be there. For them. And that assumption was about to cost them everything. Margaret Whitmore did not arrive quietly. I heard her before I saw her, the soft hum of a luxury engine climbing the grade like it had done it 100 times before, smooth and confident, completely out of place against the raw sounds of construction. Her SUV came into view just past the lower bend, white paint catching the sunlight, clean enough to reflect the dust it was driving through without ever looking like it belonged to it. She stopped about 20 feet from where I was standing, the engine idling low, controlled, like even the machine knew it was under her command. The door opened with a muted click, and she stepped out in heels that had no business being on gravel, yet somehow never slipped. Everything about her looked deliberate. Pressed blouse, tailored pants, sunglasses that hid her eyes, but not the way her head tilted slightly when she looked at something she had already decided was hers. She did not ask who I was. She did not need to. The faint smile on her face told me she had already been briefed, already filed me away as a minor inconvenience in a project that was too big to stop. "You must be Ethan," she said, voice smooth, almost warm, but with an edge underneath that felt rehearsed. Not friendly, not hostile, just certain. I nodded once, letting the silence sit between us for a second longer than most people are comfortable with. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of cut wood and hot metal down the slope, wrapping around us like a reminder of what was already in motion. She glanced up toward the cabins, then back at me, like she was giving me time to appreciate the scale of what had already been done. "Beautiful land," she continued, adjusting her sunglasses slightly. It was a shame to see it sitting unused. There it was. Not an apology, not even an excuse, just a statement of belief. I could hear a nail gun pop in the distance, sharp and rhythmic, each burst echoing like punctuation to her words. I followed her gaze up the hill, watching a crew lift framing into place with practiced efficiency. "Unused," I repeated, letting the words settle in my mouth like something bitter. She smiled again, a little wider this time, as if she had expected resistance, but not anything meaningful. "The community has been expanding," she said. "Demand is high, and this location," she paused, sweeping a hand toward the ridge line. "Well, it practically sells itself." I noticed the folder tucked under her arm then. Clean edges. Official. Probably filled with permits, zoning approvals, documents stamped and signed by people who had never set foot on this hill. She tapped it lightly with her fingers, almost absent-mindedly, but the gesture was intentional. A quiet display of authority. "Everything has been handled through the proper channels," she added, tone shifting just enough to make it clear the conversation was not a negotiation. "We are fully within our rights." I let my eyes drop to the road for a second, following the curve as it wound down the hill, disappearing behind the trees before connecting to the county line 2 miles out. My road. Every inch of it. I could still feel the weight of the equipment I used to build it, the resistance of the ground before it gave way, The exact grade percentage I had calculated so water would run off instead of pooling. Details most people never think about. Details she clearly had not. Another truck passed behind her, tires compressing the gravel with that familiar, steady crunch, and for a moment she stepped slightly aside without even realizing it, adjusting her stance to accommodate something she believed she controlled. That was the moment it clicked into place. Not the cabins. Not the permits. Her. The way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she assumed the system would always bend in her favor. She had built her entire position on paperwork and confidence, on connections and approvals that looked solid on paper, but had never been tested against something real, against something physical, against something that did not care about signatures or titles. She looked back at me, waiting, expecting an argument, a protest, maybe even a raised voice she could dismiss. Instead, I just nodded once more, slow and deliberate, like I was accepting something. Her smile sharpened, satisfied, as if that nod confirmed everything she already believed. What she did not understand was that I was not agreeing with her. I was measuring her. And more importantly, I was measuring exactly how far she had built her entire operation on a road she did not own. I did not argue with her. That was the part she did not expect. Most people, when they realize something is being taken from them, they react. Voices get louder. Hands start moving. They try to fight the moment instead of understanding it. I just stood there, listening. The wind carried the sound of a circular saw cutting through fresh lumber somewhere up the hill, that high-pitched whine followed by the soft thud of wood hitting the ground. It repeated over and over, steady, confident, like a metronome marking progress that did not belong to them. Margaret took my silence as permission. I could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her weight shifted slightly onto one foot, like she had already closed the conversation in her head. "We will make sure you are compensated fairly for any inconvenience," she added, almost as an afterthought, like she was offering a courtesy instead of acknowledging a problem. The word compensated hung in the air, thin and hollow. You do not compensate someone for something they never agreed to give. You negotiate, or you take. And she had already decided which one this was. Another truck climbed past us, this one loaded with stone, the suspension groaning under the weight as it followed the exact grade I had designed to handle that kind of load without slipping. The driver did not slow down, did not ask permission, did not even hesitate. That told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on before I showed up. This was not day one. This was momentum. "You should have received notices," she continued, tapping that folder again, her voice taking on a slightly sharper tone, like she was correcting a misunderstanding that only existed in her version of events. Everything was filed. Views. Escape from the city. All built on an assumption. "That's so," I said, keeping my voice even, almost casual. No edge. No urgency. Just enough to let her know I had heard her. She smiled again, smaller this time, more controlled, like she was closing a deal. "That is so," she replied. The wind shifted again, and this time it carried the faint scent of hot asphalt from the lower stretch of the road where the sun had started warming the surface. It mixed with the dust and the wood and the fuel, creating a smell I knew better than anything else. It smelled like infrastructure, like something built to hold weight, something built to control flow. I let my eyes follow the line of the road once more, tracing it from where we stood all the way down to where it disappeared beyond the tree line. Every curve, every grade, every drainage cut exactly where it needed to be. There was no alternate path, no secondary access, no hidden entry point they could fall back on if something changed. Just the one. Always the one. Margaret shifted slightly, glancing at her watch, already preparing to move on to whatever came next in her schedule. Meetings. Calls. Decisions made in rooms far away from the ground they affected, holding their entire operation together. I let the trucks keep coming. That was the part that would have confused most people if they were watching from the outside. No calls to the county. No signs thrown up in protest. No confrontations at the base of the hill. Just me, stepping off to the side of the road every time another vehicle rolled past, gravel shifting under my boots as the weight of their progress pressed deeper into something they did not understand. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of construction settled into a pattern you could almost set your watch by. Engines in the morning, right around 6:30. The low rumble echoing through the valley before the sun even cleared the ridge. By 8, The hill was alive with movement. Nail guns snapping in quick bursts, compressors hissing, generators humming steady like a heartbeat that did not belong there. The smell changed too. At first it was raw timber and diesel, sharp and new. Then came insulation, adhesives, paint. By the third week, you could catch the faint scent of treated wood baking under the afternoon sun, mixed with the dust that never quite settled no matter how many times the road got packed down. My road. I drove it every evening after they cleared out, slow and deliberate, tires following the same lines I had carved years ago, checking every bend, every drainage cut, every stretch where the grade shifted just enough to matter. Nothing had changed. Two of the structures. Windows installed, catching the light just right. A sign staked near the center clearing, bright lettering advertising weekend availability, booking information already printed like the place had been operating for years instead of weeks. That was when it hit me. They were not just building. They were selling. Fast. I pulled my phone out and checked the listing. Every unit marked as reserved. Opening weekend scheduled. Prices set high enough to signal exclusivity, low enough to fill quickly. They were moving with confidence, like nothing could interrupt the timeline they had already committed to. I stood there for a long second, feeling the heat press against my skin, listening to the steady hum of a system that believed it was complete. Then I turned and walked back down to my truck without saying a word to anyone. That night, I spread everything out on my kitchen table. Deed documents, survey maps, original filings from when I built the road. The paper had that faint dry smell, like dust and ink and time, edges worn just enough to remind me how long I had held on to them. I ran my fingers along the boundary lines, tracing the route of the road from the county connection all the way up to the crest of the hill. No breaks. No shared access points. No legal language granting use beyond what I had explicitly allowed. Which was nothing. Out. The next morning, I woke up before the trucks. Against everything else. Next to them, the gate. Heavy duty. Powder-coated. Industrial grade. Not something you install for decoration. Something you install when you mean it. The engine noise grew louder. The truck finally coming into view at the far end of the county road, turning toward the entrance like it had done every morning without question. I watched it for a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. No hesitation. No doubt. Just routine. I turned back to the posts and picked one up, the weight settling into my hands. Solid. Familiar. This was not rushed. I had measured this spot the night before. Marked it. Checked the alignment twice. The spacing had to be exact, not just for strength, but for legality. Everything about this needed to be clean. Defensible. I set the first post into position, pressing it down into the ground where the soil gave just enough to guide it into place. The sound of the truck engine behind me grew louder, then slowed slightly as the driver noticed something was different. Not enough to stop, just enough to register. I did not look back. Instead, I reached for the level, placing it against the side of the post, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch until the bubble settled perfectly between the lines. Straight. True. The way it needed to be. The second post went in a few feet over, measured out exactly, no guesswork, no shortcuts. The space between them framed the entrance in a way that felt final, like drawing a line that had always been there, just never visible until now. By the time I lifted the gate into place, the truck had come to a full stop a few yards away. The engine idled, louder now in the quiet morning, a low vibration you could feel in your chest if you stood close enough. I could sense the driver watching, trying to understand what he was looking at, why the routine had changed without warning. I tightened the final bolt slowly, the metal clicking into place with a clean, deliberate sound that echoed just enough to carry. Then I stepped back, wiped my hands on my jeans, and finally turned around. The road was no longer open. And for the first time since they started building, neither was the assumption that it always would be. The driver killed. The engine after a few seconds, like the silence might help him make sense of what he was seeing. It did not. The air settled around us, thick with that early morning stillness, broken only by the ticking of hot metal as his truck cooled and the faint rustle of wind brushing across the dry grass on either side of the road. I could hear it all clearly now, every small sound sharpened by the absence of movement. He opened the door slowly, boots hitting the gravel with a hesitant crunch, not the confident stride of someone arriving at a job site, but the careful steps of someone walking into a situation that did not match the plan. "Morning," he said, voice neutral, but with a question underneath it he had not put into words yet. I nodded once, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides, posture steady, nothing aggressive, nothing uncertain, just present. His eyes moved past me to the gate, then back to me, then down the length of the road like he was trying to confirm there was not another way around that he had somehow missed. There was not. I watched the realization settle in, slow and quiet, the way it does when someone understands something simple that changes everything. "We are supposed to be up there by 7, he added after a moment, glancing at his watch, then back at the hill where the cabins sat just out of reach, catching the early light like they were already open for business. I followed his gaze for a second, then brought my eyes back to him. "Road is closed," I said, calm, even, no explanation layered on top of it. Just the fact. He shifted his weight slightly, gravel sliding under his boot, that small sound carrying in the quiet space between us. "Closed?" he repeated, like the word itself did not quite fit the situation he had been sent into. I nodded again, just enough to confirm it without adding anything else. He looked at the posts, the gate, the alignment, the hardware. You could tell he recognized the difference between something temporary and something meant to stay. This was not a warning. This was a decision. Another engine sound echoed in the distance. Then another, the rest of the morning crew making their way toward the same assumption he had just run into. The first truck pulled up behind him, then a second, each one slowing, stopping, the line forming without anyone saying a word. Doors opened. More boots on gravel. Low voices, questions starting to pass between them, not directed at me yet, just trying to piece together what had changed. I stayed where I was, hands loose, breathing steady, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. The sun climbed a little higher, warming the surface of the road, bringing out that familiar scent of heated stone and dust, a smell that had always meant work to me. Now it meant something else. Control. One of the drivers stepped closer, looking at the gate, then at me. "Who put this up?" he asked, not confrontational, just trying to understand the new rules. "I did," I answered. Simple, direct, no hesitation. He glanced back at the others, then up the hill again, where the cabins stood quiet, waiting for a day that had already been scheduled, already been sold. The gap between expectation and reality widened with every second that passed. Phones started coming out, calls being made, names being mentioned. Someone said Margaret's name under their breath, like that alone should have been enough to solve the problem. I could hear the faint ring of a phone connecting somewhere, the low murmur of a conversation starting to build on the other end. I did not move. I did not interrupt. I just stood there at the entrance, exactly where ownership begins, exactly where assumptions end. The road stretched out behind the gate, empty for the first time in weeks, no engines climbing, no tires grinding against the surface I built. It looked different like that, quieter, truer. And as the line of trucks grew and the conversations picked up, one thing became clear to everyone standing there, even if no one said it out loud. The routine was over, and whatever came next was not going to follow the plan they thought they had. The calls did not take long to escalate. You could hear it in the tone before you even understood the words, that shift from confusion to urgency, as whoever was on the other end started realizing this was not a simple delay. One driver stepped away from the group, pacing a few feet down the shoulder, boots kicking small stones loose as he talked into his phone, voice low but tight. Another leaned against his truck, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the gate like staring at it long enough might change what it was. I stayed where I was, just inside the boundary line, close enough to hear, but not close enough to be pulled into their conversations. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning cool, bringing a dry heat that settled across the road and pulled the scent of dust and metal up into the air. It felt still, but underneath that stillness, everything was shifting. One of the drivers finally looked back at me, hesitation written across his face, then stepped forward again. "They are saying this is private property," he said, repeating what he was being told, like he needed to confirm it out loud. I gave a small nod. "It is." He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries acceptance more than frustration. "They are asking if there is another access point." I let a second pass, just enough for the silence to answer before I did. "There is not." Behind him, more engines approached, then slowed, then stopped. The line stretched further now, trucks and service vehicles stacked along the county road, each one arriving with the same expectation and leaving it behind as soon as they saw the gate. The conversations grew louder, overlapping, fragments of plans breaking apart in real time. Someone mentioned guests arriving later that morning. Someone else said supplies were scheduled for delivery before noon. Timelines, reservations, commitments, all of it running straight into a fixed point that did not move. A phone rang again, sharper this time, and I saw the first driver glance down at the screen before answering immediately. His posture changed as he listened, back straightening slightly, eyes flicking toward me, then away, then back again. He nodded once, even though the person on the other end could not see it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice more formal now. That told me everything I needed to know. A few seconds later, he hung up and turned to me with a look that was trying to stay neutral, but could not quite hide the weight behind it. "She is on her way," he said. I did not ask who. I did not need to. The air seemed to tighten slightly after that, like the moment before a storm when everything pauses just long enough to make you aware of what is coming. The drivers shifted positions, some stepping back, others leaning against their trucks, all of them waiting now instead of moving. The road behind the gate stayed empty, untouched, a clean stretch of compacted gravel leading up toward the cabins that sat silent in the distance. For the first time since they were built, nothing was reaching them. No materials, no workers, no guests, just stillness. I glanced up the hill, watching the sunlight hit the structures, bright and inviting from a distance, completely disconnected from the reality forming at the base. It looked like a place ready to open. It looked like something that should have been full of movement. But from where I stood, it might as well have been miles away instead of just a few thousand feet. The gap between what they had built and what they could actually use had finally become visible. And as the sound of another engine approached from farther down the road, smoother, more controlled than the rest, I could feel the shift settle into place completely. This was no longer about construction. This was about access. And access was not something you could assume once someone decided to take it back. Her SUV came into view exactly the way I expected it would, smooth and controlled, cutting through the line of stopped trucks like it still belonged to a different reality than the one forming at the gate. The engine was quieter than the rest, refined, almost detached from the rough texture of gravel and dust that surrounded it. It rolled forward slowly, drivers stepping aside without being told, clearing a path out of habit more than instruction. Authority has a way of doing that. Margaret stepped out before the vehicle had fully settled, sunglasses already in place, posture straight, movements precise. But this time, there was something different. Not in what she wore, not in how she walked. It was in the pace, slightly faster, slightly sharper, like the situation had not unfolded the way she expected, and she was adjusting in real time. Her eyes moved from the line of trucks to the gate, then finally to me, and for a brief second, the calculation behind them became visible. Not confusion. Not yet. Just recalibration. "What is this?" she asked, voice controlled but tighter than before each. Word placed carefully, like she was choosing how much authority to apply. I did not answer immediately. I let the sound of the idling engines fill the space, the low vibrations layering over the stillness that had settled across the road. Then I spoke, steady, even. "It is a closed road." The words landed clean, without decoration, without explanation. Her gaze shifted to the posts, the alignment, the hardware, taking in details she had not bothered to consider before. You could see her mind working through it, matching what she was seeing against what she thought she knew. "You cannot just block access to an active development," she said, stepping closer, heels pressing into the gravel with a sharper sound than before. The calm in her voice was still there, but now it had edges. I watched her for a second, then glanced past her toward the line of vehicles, the workers waiting, the schedule already breaking apart behind her. "I did not block access," I replied. "I closed my road." That distinction hung between us, subtle but absolute. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, something shifted. It was small. Most people would not have noticed it. But I did, because it was the moment her confidence met something it had not accounted for. "We have permits," she said, lifting the folder slightly like it still carried weight here, like paper could move steel or reopen something that had been physically shut. Everything was approved. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "That may be true," I said, "but your permits do not extend to my property." The words were not raised. They did not need to be. Around us, the drivers had gone quiet, conversations fading into low murmurs as attention shifted fully to the exchange. Even the wind seemed to pull back, leaving the space clear, focused. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to register, and she glanced past me, down the length of the road, as if expecting to find a flaw, an alternative, some overlooked detail that would restore the control she was used to. There was none. The road stretched out clean and empty behind the gate, every inch of it exactly where it had always been. Only now it was visible for what it was. Not part of her system. Not part of her plan. Mine. She stepped closer again, lowering her voice just a fraction, like proximity might change the outcome. This is going to cause significant disruption, she said. Guests are arriving. Deliveries are scheduled. You are interfering with a lawful operation. I held her gaze, steady, unmoved. No, I said quietly. I am defining the boundary of my property. The difference was not in volume. It was in certainty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sun had climbed higher now, heat settling into the road, pulling the scent of dust and metal up into the air again. Behind her, engines idled, a line of halted momentum stretching down the county road. In front of her, the gate stood fixed, unchanged, unresponsive to expectation. That was when it finally showed. Not anger, not frustration, something else. The first real crack in the assumption that she could control how this would go. Because for the first time since this started, she was not dealing with paperwork or process. She was dealing with something that did not move unless I decided it would. Margaret held her ground for a moment longer, but I could see the shift happening behind her eyes. Not defeat. Not yet. This was the phase where people like her try to reassert control, not by understanding the problem, but by overwhelming it. She took a small step back, creating just enough distance to pull her phone out, movements sharper now, more deliberate. The screen lit up against the morning light as she scrolled quickly, then pressed it to her ear without taking her eyes off me. Get me county enforcement, she said, voice low but firm, already moving past me like the situation had escalated beyond a simple conversation. Around us, the drivers leaned in slightly, not physically closer, but in attention, like the outcome of that call might determine how the rest of their day unfolded. I could hear the faint ring through the silence, then the connection, then her tone shifting into something more official, more practiced. She spoke in terms that sounded structured, controlled, built for systems that rely on hierarchy. Property interference, active development, obstruction, words that carried weight in offices and meeting rooms. Words that did not move steel posts set into the ground. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, listening without reacting. The sun had climbed high enough now to start pulling heat into the metal of the gate, warming it until it gave off that faint, clean scent of heated coating, something subtle but familiar. Time passed differently in moments like that. Not fast, not slow, just stretched. Eventually, she pulled the phone away, her expression tightening slightly before she masked it again. They are sending someone out, she said, slipping the phone back into place like that alone restored the balance. This will be resolved shortly. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. Because in her mind, resolution meant restoration. It meant returning things to the way she believed they should be. What she did not understand was that nothing here had been changed. It had just been recognized. The weight settled in after that. Engines idled. Conversations dropped to low murmurs. The heat built gradually, pressing down on the road, lifting the smell of dust and gravel into the air in waves that shimmered just above the surface. I walked a few steps to the side, resting one hand lightly against the post, feeling the solid weight of it, the way it held steady without giving. That steadiness mattered. It always had. About 20 minutes later, the distant sound of another vehicle approached, different from the rest. Slower. Measured. A county truck came into view, marked clearly, tires rolling over the edge of the gravel before coming to a stop just behind Margaret's SUV. The engine cut, and a man stepped out, adjusting his hat as he took in the scene. His eyes moved the same way mine had the first time. Gate. Trucks. Hill. Then me. He walked forward, boots crunching in a steady rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant. Just professional. Morning, he said, voice even neutral. I returned the nod. Margaret stepped in immediately, filling the space with explanation, her words quick, structured, confident. She laid out her version of events, pointing toward the hill, referencing permits, timelines, guests expected within hours. It sounded complete, logical, convincing, if you only listened to one side. The man listened without interrupting, eyes occasionally shifting toward the gate, then back to her, then briefly to me. When she finished, there was a short pause, the kind that carries weight because it is not filled right away. He turned slightly toward me. "This your road?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Simple, direct, no hesitation. He nodded. Once, then took a few steps closer to the gate, examining the posts, the alignment, the placement relative to the boundary line. He did not rush it. He did not assume. He checked. That was the difference. After a moment, he stepped back and looked between the two of us. "Do they have legal access through here?" he asked, directing the question outward, not just at me, but at the situation itself. Margaret answered first. "They have approved development permits," she said, as if that covered everything. He nodded slowly, then looked back at me. I held his gaze. "No easement," I said. "No shared access. This is private." The words settled into the space, clear and grounded in something that did not shift with pressure. The man exhaled once, then adjusted his stance, turning slightly toward Margaret. "If there is no legal easement," he said carefully, "then access cannot be enforced through private property." The effect was immediate, even if no one spoke. It moved through the line of trucks, through the air, through the assumption that had been holding everything together. Margaret's expression did not collapse. It tightened, controlled, contained. But the crack was there now, visible, undeniable. Because the system she relied on had just confirmed something she never thought she would have to consider. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a limit, and it was not hers to decide. The silence after that statement did not break right away. It stretched across the road, across the line of trucks, across the hill itself like something had shifted beneath everything and no one was quite ready to move yet. The county officer did not say anything more. He did not need to. He had already drawn the line, and it was not one Margaret could step over with a signature or a phone call. She stood there for a second, still facing him, still holding that controlled posture, but now there was a pause in her timing, a delay where there had never been one before. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the hill, then back to the gate, then finally to me, and for the first time since this started, there was no assumption in that look. There was calculation, yes. There was frustration, contained and carefully managed. But there was also recognition, not of defeat, not yet, but of reality. Behind her, one of the drivers shut off his engine completely, the sudden drop in sound making the quiet feel heavier, more defined. Another followed, then another, until the steady hum that had filled the morning faded into scattered mechanical ticks and the occasional shift of gravel under someone's boot. The momentum was gone. And without momentum, everything else started to unravel. A phone rang again, this time from somewhere further back in the line, sharper, more urgent. Someone answered quickly, voice rising just enough to carry fragments forward. Words like cancellation, delay, reschedule floated through the air, each one landing like a small adjustment that added up to something much larger. Margaret turned slightly, pulling her phone out again, but this time there was no immediate call. She stared at the screen for a second longer than before, like she was weighing options that did not look as solid as they had an hour ago. Then she stepped aside, lowering her voice as she finally made the call, pacing a few feet away, heels pressing into the gravel with a tighter rhythm. I did not follow her. I did not need to hear the details. I already knew the shape of that conversation. Explanation first, then justification, then pressure. But pressure only works when there is something to push against. And the gate did not move. I turned slightly and looked up the road again, letting my eyes travel the full length of it, from where I stood all the way to the crest where the cabin sat in the distance. The sunlight was stronger now, reflecting off the windows, making them flash briefly as the angle shifted. From up there, it probably looked like a perfect morning. Quiet, scenic, ready, but no one was arriving. No one was unloading supplies. No footsteps on the decks. No doors opening. Just stillness. I could almost hear the absence of activity, the gap where sound should have been. That was the part people underestimate. It is not the action that defines control. It is the ability to stop it. The county officer stepped back toward his truck, adjusting his hat again, his role here already complete. He gave me a short nod, then glanced once more at the gate before turning away. No enforcement. No order. Just acknowledgement. That was enough. Margaret ended her call and turned back toward me, but she did not step as close this time. The distance between us stayed where it was, like something invisible had settled into place. "This is not over," she said, voice steady, but missing the certainty it carried before. I met her gaze without shifting. "No," I said quietly. "It is just starting." The difference was not in the words. It was in who understood them. Around us, drivers were already climbing back into their trucks, engines starting one by one, but not to move forward, to turn around. The first vehicle reversed slowly, tires grinding against the gravel, then pulled out onto the county road and headed back the way it came. Another followed. Then another. The line that had built itself on assumption was dissolving the same way, one decision at a time. I stood there as it happened, hands relaxed, posture steady, watching the flow reverse. The road behind the gate remained untouched, silent, exactly as it should have been. And for the first time since they started building on that hill, everything they had created was cut off from the one thing it needed to function. Not destroyed, not removed, just unreachable. By noon, the hill had started to feel different, even from where I stood. It was not something you could point to right away, not a visible change in structure or layout, but a shift in presence. Places built for activity carry a certain energy when they are used the way they were intended. Movement, sound, small disruptions that signal life. Without that, everything settles into something else. Stillness. The kind that makes even new construction feel older than it is. I could see it in the way the sunlight sat on the cabins now, uninterrupted, no shadows passing across the decks, no doors opening, no vehicles pulling up with that crunch of arrival that had become routine over the past few weeks. It looked complete, but it did not function, and that difference mattered more than anything they had built. Down at the road, the last of the trucks had already turned around, engines fading into the distance one by one until the only sound left was the occasional gust of wind moving across the open ground. The dust they had stirred up earlier had settled again, leaving the surface of the road clean, undisturbed, like it had reset itself. Margaret had not left. Not yet. She stood a few yards away from her SUV, phone in hand, posture still straight, but no longer fixed in the same confident rhythm. Calls came and went. I could see it in the way her expression shifted slightly each time. Small changes that most people would miss, but that told the full story if you knew what to look for. This was no longer a situation she could solve by pushing harder. This was a structure problem, and structure problems do not respond to pressure. They respond to limits. At one point, she glanced up toward the hill again, longer this time, like she was finally seeing it for what it was instead of what it was supposed to be. An investment. A plan. A promise made to people who expected something they could not now deliver. I walked a few steps along the gate, running my hand lightly along the top rail, feeling the warmth from the sun building in the metal. Solid. Unmoved. Exactly where it needed to be. That consistency was what everything else had been built on, even if they never realized it. Access is invisible when it works. It becomes the only thing that matters when it does not. A car approached slowly from the county road. Not a truck this time. Something smaller, cleaner, stopping at a distance when the driver saw the gate. They sat there for a moment, engine idling, then pulled out their phone, probably checking directions, maybe a reservation confirmation, something that still told them this place was open, available, ready. After a minute, they turned around and left, the quiet departure almost more noticeable than the earlier line of trucks. That was the real impact. Not the workers, not the schedule. The people who were supposed to arrive and stay, to fill those cabins with life, to validate everything that had been built. Without them, the structures were just shapes on a hill. Margaret finally ended another call and lowered the phone slowly, her gaze dropping for a second before she lifted it again, composure returning, but thinner now, stretched over something that had already started to shift underneath. She looked at me, not with the same certainty as before, but with something closer to recognition. Not of authority, of position. She understood now that this was not a temporary obstacle. This was a boundary that had always existed, one she had chosen to ignore until it became impossible to do so. "We will find a solution," she said, voice steady, but no longer carrying the same weight. It sounded more like a statement she needed to believe than one she could enforce. I did not answer right away. I let the quiet settle again, the kind that comes when everything that was supposed to happen does not. Then I nodded once, small, measured. Not agreement. Not refusal. Just acknowledgement of what she was now facing. Because finding a solution meant one thing she had avoided from the beginning. It meant coming back to the ground. Back to what was actually there. Not what had been approved. Not what had been planned. What existed. And what existed was simple. A hill full of finished cabins. And a road that decided whether any of it mattered at all. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. The kind of quiet that does not feel empty but resolved. By then, Margaret had left. Not in a rush. Not in defeat. But with the controlled pace of someone who understands that pushing further in the moment will not change the outcome. Her SUV disappeared down the county road the same way it arrived, smooth and composed. But this time it did not carry the same weight. What she took with her was not control. It was a problem she could not solve from a distance. I stayed a while longer, leaning lightly against the post, watching the hill as the sun began its slow shift west. The light changed the way it always does in the afternoon, softening edges, stretching shadows across the ground. The cabins caught that light in a different way now, less like something new and more like something waiting. Waiting for movement that did not come. Waiting for a purpose that had been interrupted before it ever really started. A breeze moved through the area, carrying the faint scent of warm wood and dust, but without the overlay of engines and tools. It felt cleaner, more honest. This was what the land sounded like when it was left alone. I walked a few steps out into the road, boots pressing into the surface that had already begun to settle again, the fine layer of dust smoothing over the tracks left by the morning. Every detail was exactly where it should be. The alignment of the posts, the spacing of the gate, the boundary that had always existed, now visible to anyone who chose to look. That was the difference. Nothing here had been created to stop them. It had always been here. They had just built around it without understanding what it meant. I took one last look up toward the ridge, letting my eyes move across each structure, each line of framing, each window catching the last of the afternoon light. They had done good work. Solid construction. Careful planning. All of it real. All of it complete. But completion does not equal control. That lesson does not show up in blueprints or permits. It shows up here, at the point where something meets the limits it cannot bypass. I turned back toward the gate and rested my hand against the metal again, feeling the heat it had gathered through the day, steady and unchanged. That steadiness mattered. It always had. My father used to say that land does not argue. It does not explain. It simply holds the truth of who has the right to shape it and who does not. And standing there, with the road quiet behind me and the hill silent in front of me, that truth felt as clear as it ever had. They had built something they believed they owned. I had simply decided whether they could reach it. I stepped back from the gate, giving it one last look before heading toward my truck, the sound of my boots on gravel the only movement left on that stretch of land. As the engine turned over and I pulled away, I glanced once more in the rearview mirror. The gate stood exactly where I left it. Unmoved. Unquestioned. Final. Because in the end, it was never about stopping them from building. It was about reminding them that access is not something you assume. It is something you earn. And until they understood that, the road would remain exactly as it was. Closed.